IHRR seminar. Today we have Simin Davoudi, who is an architect, a good friend, and the director of GURU, which is the Global Urban Research Unit of Newcastle University. More specifically, GURU is located at the Architectural Planning and Landscape School. And one of the reasons why we really wanted to invite Simin is because she's been working on ideas of resilience in the city for the past 3 years now, or maybe more?
Maybe more.
Yeah.
Yes, life, yes. Time flies, yes.
So we're actually very, very excited to have this coming together of the urban and ideas of resilience today with Simin. So I'll just leave Simin to take the lead.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andres, and thank you very much for the invitation, for having me here. It's such a pleasure. Just a tiny correction, I used to be an architect, so my first degree is in architecture, but for the last 30 years I'm a planner. Okay, so there's a bit of a correction there. I am an urban planner, but with an architecture background, but we are, as Andres said, we are a merged school of architecture, planning and landscape, so we all work together on issues around built environment. And I am going to talk about resilience, maybe in a bit in broad terms. So let me start so that we have enough time for questions and discussions and comments afterwards. Let me begin with saying the obvious, if you like, that we live at a time when we are constantly reminded of the unpredictability of what is lurking around the corner. And among the various rationalities for governing this state of flux, resilience is the one that's gained a remarkable discursive currency. It's almost become like...
That's where we lower the lights a little bit.
Yeah, but not too much so that I can see my papers.
Let me see.
Just a little bit.
I'm sure it's on here.
That's
Oh,
it. Excellent. That's enough. Yeah,
It's
enough.
fun who lectures in what room
Yes.
to know how it works.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, as you can see here from this slide, resilience is almost everywhere, becoming the buzzword of our time, and to the extent that it seems that it's kind of replacing sustainability as the new catch-all concept. But its widespread appeal is by no means a sign of common understanding of what the concept means, and also the desirability of resilience as a policy objective. On the contrary, resilience risks being an empty signifier which can be filled with multiple meanings to serve conflicting interests. So to bring some clarity to the concept, I'm going to start by unpicking its different meanings. Then I will outline some of the political and normative implications of translating resilience from its ecological origin to the social domain. I'll finish by arguing that a particular interpretation of resilience has been co-opted into policy discourses that is very much in tune with neoliberal ideologies. And that may explain why public policy has been so receptive to the concept of resilience. So starting from the first part. Resilience has a unique genealogy, multiple roots in systems theory, engineering, ecology, psychology, and disaster studies. Engineers were amongst the first to use it to define systems stability and resistance to external shocks. Then in the 1960s, it entered the field of ecology through the pioneering work of a Canadian ecologist called Buzz Holling. He radically changed the classic systems theory of ecological dynamics. And in a seminal article in 1973, he made a distinction between engineering and ecological resilience, defining engineering resilience as the ability of a system to return to equilibrium after a disturbance. So the resistance to disturbance and the speed of return are the measures of resilience. The faster the system bounces back, the more resilient it is. This engineering understanding of resilience is rooted in the Newtonian view of the world as an orderly mechanical device, if you like, a giant clock, which is in a state of equilibrium and can be governed by a set of mathematical rules. Although it was acknowledged at the time that the laws of nature were unknown, it was believed that the only limit to knowing them were epistemic or scientific limits. And this view of knowledge as capable of knowing what is to be known informed rationalities of the post-war liberal governments, and to some extent their top-down command and control. As you can see from these examples, the equilibrium perspective on resilience has influenced a wide range of disciplines, including, again, psychology, disaster studies, economic geography, climate change, and urban planning. In urban planning, which is my area, the quest for spatial equilibrium has a long and enduring legacy. And those of you who are familiar with planning and architecture, you know about the modernist vision of a good city. And a classic example is the Charter of Athens, 1934, for which a good city was a city in a state of equilibrium amongst all its respective functions. Le Corbusier, who wrote the Charter, famously suggested that such a steady state could be achieved by the commanding power of plan. In his 1973 paper, Holling provided an alternative ecological definition of resilience, which puts the emphasis on the magnitude of the disturbance that can be absorbed before the system changes its function and structures. So here, the measure of resilience is not how long it takes for the system to bounce back, but also how much disturbance it can take and stays within critical threshold. The significance of Holling's work lies in his departure from the mechanistic assertions of equilibrium and his adoption of complexity science in the field of ecology. So ecological resilience considers the world as complex, uncertain, and inherently unpredictable. The emphasis is not just on the epistemic limit to knowing the unknown, but also the logical impossibility of knowing the unknown. And given the unknowability of unknowns, Holling calls for a qualitative capacity to devise systems that can absorb and accommodate future events in whatever unexpected form they may take. Then in his later work, Holling and his fellow ecologists in Resilience Alliance expanded the resilience thinking beyond ecology and into the realm of society. And to mark the shift, they changed the name of their journal from Conservation Ecology to Ecology and Society, and then started to use the term socio-ecological resilience. And I've called it, and some other people have called it, evolutionary resilience. Evolutionary resilience challenges notions of order, status, and equilibrium. It considers complex systems as non-linear, self-organizing. Remember that word, self-organizing, because it's critical to what I'm going to say later. So it considers complex systems as non-linear, self-organizing, and permeated by discontinuity and uncertainty. Here, unpredictable shifts can happen with or without external shocks, and with or without proportional or linear cause and effect. So what it does, that it sets the resilience of a system in the context of the evolution of the system itself. In this perspective, resilience is not about a return to so-called normality, but about the ability of the systems to change, to adapt, and crucially, to transform in response to stress. It's about creating, if you like, untried beginnings from which a new trajectory can evolve. It's about breaking away from undesired normal. And furthermore, resilience is not a fixed asset or a trait, but a continually changing process, not a being, but a becoming. It may emerge when systems are confronted with disturbance and stress. In the social context, this implies that people may become resilient, not in spite of adversity, but because of it, or as Hemingway has put it so eloquently. As I said, the Resilience Alliance is advocating the use of evolutionary resilience, not only in ecosystems, but also as a general systems theory that can integrate society, economy, and ecology in a total complex system. They suggest that this totality can be approached heuristically as non-linear iteration of an adaptive cycle with 4 distinct phases: growth, conservation, creative destruction, a term they use from Schumpeter, the economist, and reorganization. So in a nutshell, the first loop of the cycle relates to the emergence, development, and stabilization of a particular pathway. And then the second loop relates to its rigidification and decline, and while at the same time signaling the opening up of unpredictable possibilities, or what they call a spontaneous reorganization, which may lead to a new growth path. So as systems mature, their resilience reduces and they become an accident waiting to happen. And when systems collapse, a window of opportunity opens up for alternative pathways. This disruptive phase is therefore a time of greatest uncertainty, yet high resilience. It's the time of innovation and transformation, when a crisis can be turned into an opportunity. So in this Panarchy model, this is their words, systems function in a series of nested adaptive cycles that interact at multiple scales, speeds, and time frames. So small changes can amplify and cascade into a regime shift, while large interventions may have little or no effect. Which means that past behavior of a system is no longer a reliable predictor of its future behavior, even when circumstances are the same. Evolutionary resilience is a great step forward in systems thinking. It's a reflection of a paradigm shift in science, where nothing is certain except uncertainty itself. However, when it's applied to the social context, it becomes conceptually problematic and normatively contested. is conceptually problematic because although both ecological and social systems are complex, their feedback processes are different. In social systems, people's responses are driven not just by structural forces, but also by their agency and intention. They consciously and intentionally take action, both individually and collectively. The picture tries to say that forests cannot stop fires, humans can. But the adaptive cycle, which I showed you, is overly deterministic, doesn't allow for human action to break the cycles through their ingenuity, technology, and foresight. Ecologists themselves acknowledge this and suggest that in the social context, adaptive cycles and their outcomes are mere tendencies rather than inevitabilities. Human agency is manifested in many ways in both our individual and collective responses to crisis. And I've just outlined four examples of that manifestation, and I'm going to elaborate on them in turn while highlighting some of the political and normative questions that arise from them. First, through our actions, we can displace the effect of a crisis in both time and space. This means that greater disturbances can be imposed on people elsewhere or in another time in the future. Good example of such spatial and temporal displacement is climate change, because the impact of emissions by, let's say, developed countries are felt most severely in developing countries elsewhere, and they will have greater impact on future generation another time. Second, human agency is distributed unequally. The exercise of power and privilege has enabled extraordinary concentration of control over resources and rights, which in turn can block what ecologists call feedback channels. Unequal access to democratic processes stops local knowledge to be fed back into the system. In ecological literature, resilience is presented as a neutral concept, partly because ecologists often subscribe to the idea that in nature there are no rewards or punishment, just consequences. Well, this is clearly not the case in social relations, where inequalities create winners and losers of resilience building. If you think about the current race to resilient city, the resilient city status, if you like, it is infused with profound distributive implications that are reflected in the emerging safe havens of segregated resilience. Power and politics also influence how resilience and its desired outcomes are defined. Again, in ecological literature, the desirable outcome is sustainability, which is often defined uncritically as a kind of a closed-loop system. In the social context, defining what constitutes resilience and what is a desirable outcome always carry normative judgments, and it varies in different contexts. For example, it's not immediately clear whether social conformity is a desirable or natural outcome of resilience or being resilient. Whether surviving on $1 a day or fleeing from war zones a mark of resilience or vulnerability. And whether resilience is always good. Some of the most resilient systems such as mafia or global drug trade, do not serve a valued purpose. And then there is the problem of systems boundary. Defining where to draw the boundaries of a given system in time and space inevitably leads to the inclusion of some people and places and exclusion of others from the resilience of the system. Boundary definition is a contested process which raises further normative questions. Again, urban planners frequently make decisions about which part of the city should be protected from, let's say, flooding, and which part may be dispensable. And that's why some people find themselves on the wrong side of the dikes. In the global geopolitical context, often decisions are made about whose life is valued and should be protected and whose is collateral. So boundary definitions such as these are rarely technical exercises. They are deeply colored by value judgments, and they are influenced by those with greater voice and better access to resources. The third manifestation of human agency is our ability to imagine how we might be otherwise. Imagination is the source of creativity, and it can shape the path of social evolution. Through our cognitive and technological capabilities, we can perceive changes at a larger scale and longer term than our sensory abilities and immediate experiences allow. We can recognize risk before it actually manifests, and we have the potential to take conscious and transformative action to reduce risks. In other words, we can diminish, sustain, or enhance resilience by being prepared. So although radical uncertainty and inherent unpredictability are the defining characteristics of our time, this doesn't necessarily mean the death of imagination, creativity, and preparedness. We can also enhance all the capabilities that I mentioned through coordinated collective action, which can shape future trajectories. But in ecological resilience, there is little room for goal-oriented action. Instead, great emphasis is put on the principle of self-organization, which in the social domain has been misguidedly, or one might say willfully, translated into self-reliance. Self-reliance firstly puts the emphasis on individuals rather than society as a whole. And secondly, it calls for the retreat of the welfare state. It implies that to be resilient, people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and reinvent themselves in the face of external challenges. It's claimed that people's resilience will be eroded if they are exposed to too much state support. You can see from some of the official documents here. Self-reliance resonates very closely with neoliberal emphasis on individualization of responsibility. It legitimizes the withdrawal of the state's support from vulnerable communities. Under the welfare state, social policy aims to create what Anthony Giddens calls a sense of ontological security, whereby citizens expect the state to support them at times of hardship. But under this self-reliant resilience mantra, people are expected to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders and become responsible as a way of being. So in a way, resilience, under this kind of self-reliant resilience, risks becoming a new existential yardstick of a responsibilized self. It can redraw the contours of citizenship. So to be a good citizen, one has to measure up to predefined notions of resilience. One indication of this, and some of you know that better than I do, can be seen in some disaster risk programs, where resilience seems to be replacing vulnerability as the main narrative, and where the victims of disasters are cast as heroes of resiliency. Indeed, it is this ideological fit with neoliberal mentality that has made public policy so receptive to the concept of resilience in a relatively short period of time. But the match between the two is not superficial and certainly not accidental. Because Buzz Holling was developing his work on resilience in the 1970s at the same time when Friedrich Hayek, a key architect of neoliberalism, was working on his theory of a spontaneous order. According to this theory, social order emerges from the interaction of self-serving individuals who use the price systems to adjust their plan. So ideally, there should be no need for the state to regulate social interactions and maintain social orders. Like Holling, Hayek also drew on complex system theory to criticize what he called the state-engineered equilibria of Keynesian demand management. Instead, he claimed that social systems are like biological systems, which have been newly defined at that time by scientists as complex, adaptive, and nonlinear. So he called for a reform of all social institutions in accordance with the self-organizing dynamics of the market. Such mentalities disparage the effectiveness of public sector intervention and celebrate not only the efficiency of the market, but also its morality. The emphasis on self-reliant individuals also reinforces the liberal view of society as a sum of individuals. Noberto Bobbio talks about that as liberal individualism, and he says it amputates the individual from the organic body and plunges him into the unknown world of the struggle for survival. Co-opted in this way, resilience can become a measure of the fitness of people and places to survive in turbulent world, almost reiterating the Darwinian law of natural selection and the survival of the fittest. The other dominating yardstick for measuring resilience is this thing called bounce back ability, which, as I said earlier, is rooted in the engineering understanding of resilience. Again, as you can see from some of these examples, like self-reliance, bouncing back to where we were has also gained a growing currency. The preferred option is to return back to a predefined normal without questioning the desirability of that normal, or without considering the possibility of a new normal. So radical transformation in this narrative is seen not as a desirable outcome, but as a system failure. The emphasis is on a speedy return to normality, and that feeds into, one might say, conservative values of maintaining the status quo, instead of seizing transformative opportunities for breaking away from undesirable normal. Here, disasters are often seen as one-off events with the beginning and an end. They are often seen as abnormal and sudden shocks that challenge the global order, of which these disasters are exceptions rather than outcome. So a lot of efforts are directed towards short-term emergency responses rather than long-term adaptive capacity building. And one of the side effects of this is this kind of a state of emergency is a call for urgent action. And because of the need for urgent action, we can get into a situation that proper political framing can be foreclosed, demand for inclusivity can be eroded, social conflicts can be renounced, and the arenas in which we can raise questions about justice and democracy can be closed. So let me just sum up. I said at the beginning, and you can see further examples here, that there is now a growing number of think tanks, philanthropic organizations, government institutions, and corporate entities that have made resilience a top priority. They've developed resilience toolkits and indicators. There seems to be a collective drive for resilience, which binds and unites otherwise pluralistic interests. In other words, a resilience machine is in the making. And that is what we are arguing in a book that is coming out later this year. We use the title of the book, which is called The Resilience Machine, as by drawing on or being inspired by Harvey Moloch's seminal paper back in 1976, The City as a Growth Machine. So like him, we argue that resilience has been normalized as a value-free and universal good. And in its machine-like deployment, normative and political concerns are lost or made invisible. It seems to us that narratives of resilience tend to mask the structural conditions that perpetuate the need for resiliency in the first place. The growing influence of resilience in public policy lies, I think, in its ability to bind the cognitive rationality of complexity science, so the evidence, if you like, and its kind of self-organization principle with the normative values of neoliberal mentality in terms of individualization of responsibility and self-reliance. And paradoxically, its take-up in policy discourse is also based on the alignment between its engineering emphasis on bouncing back to equilibrium and the conservative values of defending the status quo. The outcome of these alignments presents an alternative way of governing the unknown, which is based on a highly selective interpretation, calibration, and mobilization of complexity theory and resilience thinking. One that considers vulnerability as self-afflicted and self-reliance and a speedy return to normality as the key measure of resilience. So we are deemed to act rationally in reducing our own vulnerabilities, but in such a way that our adaptation is aligned with the goals of maintaining whatever the status quo is. So resilience has become a key site where links are forged between, to use Foucault's word, governing others and governing the self. So people become both the target of resilience building and its voluntary partner. But I'd like to finish by highlighting that there is a growing resistance to resilience. Despite the depoliticizing discourses and practices of resilience, politics, or at least agonistic politics, is alive and flourishing through the cracks in the concrete. And here's a powerful example of that. It's called the Stop Calling Me Resilient campaign, which was launched by Tracy Washington, president of Louisiana Justice Institute, in relation to media and policymakers' responses to the victims of Hurricane Katrina and BP oil spills. So in an interview, she demanded, stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they are resilient, that means you can do something else to me. I don't want to be resilient. I want to fix the things that create the need for us to be resilient in the first place. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simin. We have some time for questions, so I'd like to take some questions.
Give people a bit of time to breathe.
I don't want to know else has. I'm going to go for a theoretical one. In the physical sciences, complex systems is struggling with the term emergence and what that does to them, so particularly in terms of adaptive cycles. So where does the kind of new thinking on emergence fit in with some of this thinking?
I'm not a physical scientist, so I cannot tell you any sort of details of it, but I think emergence has very much become part of the vocabulary of resilience, whether it's in the sort of natural sciences, physical sciences, or social sciences. So it's influenced people's thinking about, even issues around governance. People talk about experimentation, for example. The idea is that things are emerging without us having any sort of hand in it. But the issue that I was trying to talk about is that when you apply that in the social context, it takes away any efforts in trying to do something that you could change the course, the trajectories, by sort of using emergence as an excuse for doing nothing. But that's my sort of understanding of its, I would say, misguided use in the social context. But you probably know a bit more, Louise, about the idea of emergence.
Yeah, some of the mathematical modelling we do would be kind of unpredictable things that come to the fore. So in a way, if you go with that use or definition, it could be quite useful.
Yeah.
Not saying that people should stop doing anything, but again, small things can create big change,
exactly.
unforeseen change in different ways. So it gets you out of that cycle of going back to something that you hold up as being the way we should go. It's helping you reimagine and enact.
Absolutely, and I think, and I would say that is the real power and advantage of this kind of evolutionary resilience thinking, which allows you to think through not going back to where you were, but considering that things can change sort of fundamentally into a different pathways. If you bring it back into planning, generally planning rather than just urban planning, and the notion of preparedness, then that will sort of that tells you about, if we can use the language of the plan B, that you cannot sort of assume that things will follow the same path, or there is a very direct cause and effect relationship that is happening, or even proportional cause and effect. So there is a lot in evolutionary resilience thinking for us to learn from. But the way I see things are happening, and some of the dominant narratives of resilience, is a very is a particular interpretation of that, which doesn't really do justice to its scientific
You
meaning.
might not be learning as well as you could from the latest developments.
In a way, I think, in a way, resilience can work as an interesting sort of conceptual bridge between natural and social sciences. So there is all that potential there.
You mentioned resilience as depoliticising in various ways, or as kind of post-democratic, I suppose we might think of it. Could I push you to kind of, I guess, sort of argue, is resilience itself post-democratic or depoliticising, or is it the frame in which resilience has been placed and the kind of the marriage of that to a set of kind of neoliberal principles that is doing that work? Is it resilience itself that has those tendencies, and then they've been kind of pushed into that kind of frame, or is it the frame that does that kind of depoliticising gesture in your
I think it's the latter, it seems to me. I think it's the way it's been co-opted into particular policies and practices, that is a particular interpretation of it. And it's the use of, generally speaking, systems, sort of the language of systems in social context. And it's not new. Sociologist Niklas Lohmer used that language many years ago of thinking about societies as systems which have subsystems. And then if you can understand what's happened to the subsystems and the sum of individuals, some of the subsystems within it, you can control the system, which is the language of the old systems theory. It's not the new complexity systems theory. But I see the interpretation of it and the way it's been co-opted into the language. And what I was trying to say is that, I do believe that ideas do matter in the narrative of change. But for them to actually penetrate into the public policy, they have to be convincing normatively and persuasive as well. So in terms of providing solution for policy dilemmas. And it seems to me that resilience does both of these. That's why I was trying to say that it draws on this cognitive rationality of complexity science, that's one side of it, which is very appealing, very interesting and exciting, but also somehow the way it's been translated, it also chimes with those values, the values of individualism, individual responsibilization, and so on. So in a way, it's a kind of a winning card. And I didn't mention that self-reliance also very nicely fits into, communitarian values of self-sufficiency, for example. They fit into idea of self-help. So that is why it's such a powerful platform, brings so many different perspectives together.
Well, I have difficulty to differentiate between recovery concept and resilient concept. So, in your views, what's the difference between these two, or recovery is part of resilience?
I think what I know about, which is the literature around sort of disaster risk management, recovery is seen as part of resilience. But in some of the documents that I have looked at, for example, adaptation strategies and London is whether I've got it here. London is a very interesting one. Well, we looked at the 2010 draft London adaptation strategy. Is one of the most advanced ones actually in the UK when it came out at that time. But you could see this tendency for linear thinking, about prevention, recovery, and then you come to recovery and then emergency planning, all good. Nobody is disputing the fact that we need to sort of, respond to crisis. But it seems that they just stop there. Then there is no further thinking about the plan B or long term, or why we are here actually. Why are we in a situation that now we have to act urgently and respond to crisis, constantly firefighting. There is no kind of those reflections. You don't see those kind of reflections there. But that's my understanding of it, of recovery as part of resilience. But the way it's being applied, there are times that you can question the way it's applied. And I think there was something to do with the flooding in New York, that some people were, I was just listening to a presentation and somebody said, we survived the crisis, what killed us was the recovery plan. I think it was Sandy, after Sandy, yeah.
Thank you, Simin, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Resilience is definitely a very complex word, subject to deal with. So, yeah, my confusion was also like, is resilience something different from recovery, resistance, and growth? Or does all those concepts come within resilience? Or so, what's the difference between these terms?
Yeah.
And another thing is like, when you talk about community resilience, the measurement and kind of thing, it's again very complex. So, how important is human resilience to say the community is resilient? Does it consist only of structures or also about human resilience kind of thing? So how do you measure? There's so many questions.
Yes, measuring is going to be the most difficult part of that, yes. I think in terms of the different words that we use, resilience is certainly not about resistance. Yes, in the engineering understanding of resilience, it is about, to some extent, it's about resistance. But it's not just about resistance. I would say it's all of those together, because you want to be, or persistence, if you like. Resistance in a short term is a good thing, isn't it? If somebody pushes you, you don't want to collapse immediately. But then it's built into it as we go through different understandings of resilience and bringing in ecological and socio-ecological understanding, then it covers other issues. It talks about adaptability and it talks about transformability. So it's all of those if you think about resilience as this sort of overarching term. But when you talk about the relationship between individuals and community and society, but that's very interesting, and thank you for that question, because there's a lot of talk about socio-ecological resilience. And the first thing is that when you look at, and somebody's done the work, they've looked at about 200 pieces of literature, and a lot of it, first of all, they reduce the notion of society to community. That's the first thing. There's a lot of socio-ecological, but when you look at it, it's all about community resilience. So that's the first. And the second thing is that sometimes, of course not always, sometimes the way this is being seen is again that kind of old-fashioned systems thinking. That, so if individuals are resilient, then the sum of individuals make up the community, therefore the community is resilient. And then if the communities are resilient, and then the society is resilient. So it works like a nested approach, which actually goes completely in the face and against complexity and sort of system, because complexity talks about the whole is bigger than the sum of its constituent part and is qualitatively different. So yeah, there are these sort of relationship between the two. And the other thing, which I must emphasize here again, is that it seems to me, or at least in the UK and in the context of UK and US and to some extent Australia, there is overemphasis on individuals. And that's why this self-reliant thing is such a, kind of individual units, whether it's the individual or an individual community or the social relations and their implications for resilience building, if you like, gets lost there.
I have a question. You've been working on cities for decades, and I'm curious to see if you had a chance to examine, explore, or think about the 100 Resilient Cities program of the Rockefeller Foundation and the coming together of the notion of resilience with the city through this particular program. How do you assess that program? What is happening? Is this an attempt to neoliberalize the city? Is this a withdrawal of the state? How would you interpret the fact that now we have over 100 cities trying to put in place these type of programs with the support of this particular foundation?
Yeah, very good question, and I do not claim that I have a good answer for it. In the book that I mentioned, one of the chapters actually talks about the Rockefeller Foundation, the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. And I think, in that chapter, I think the emphasis in that particular chapter is about, the argument is that let's not talk too much about the meaning of resilience and so on, and let's see what's happening on the ground, which is a very good point, by the way. Let's look at what's happening on the ground. And let's look at some of these kind of big documents coming out from the United Nations or the initiative from Rockefeller, and see what do they do to the governance, the urban governance. And I suppose, to answer your specific question, I haven't examined them. And I haven't studied exactly what's going on, institutionally or in terms of the strategies that are coming out. So I won't be able to give you a satisfactory answer. All I know that they have to have something in place, a strategy in place, and a chief resilience officer. That's the main contribution of Rockefeller Foundation. The city can employ a chief resilience officer. So there is a big resource for the city on a short-term basis, and they work with the city whatever, and they basically what they do is adjust the existing plans in the city, and a very diverse set of strategies are coming out. So they're not all about climate change or anything else. They identify what are the critical issues in the city and what is the plan for the future. Whether something actually happens on the ground is not part of their brief. So that's all I can say. Yes, I don't really want to just say that it's a neoliberalizing attempt, because there is a huge diversity out there. What's happening in each city is very different from another city, and there is potential for something good come out of it, certainly. Yeah, but I don't know. I haven't studied those. I from the top of my head, I can't think of a comprehensive study, because they are still coming up. I think now they've got the 100 cities. I don't know if somebody else knows about, but I haven't seen a systematic study of the 100 resilient cities. Yeah.
Perhaps one final question.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank
what are the other themes that are emerging from the book that's going to be out this
year? You mean the emerging? Well, the couple of, obviously, chapters are very diverse. There are some chapters are looking at cities, basically. Questions of justice and fairness come through some of the chapters, like Susan Feinstein's talking about that in the context of New York City and their adaptation strategy. Some of them, so some focus on, if you like, places, cities. Some of them focus on communities. There's a lot of interesting chapters related to some of the community resilience buildings. I would say, in terms of the common threads, one interesting common thread is that everybody's trying to tease out the progressive potential. So they provide a critique of what's happening in the name of resilience, but they also talk about progressive potential and how that, by the way, the book also kind of speaks to assemblage theory. Okay, so machine being understood as an assemblage. And some people use that idea and talk about the opportunity space and where the opportunity spaces are. How a particular program of community resilience, which starts from somewhere and might have some regressive dimension to it, as it gets implemented, suddenly changes. People find that opportunity to say what they want to say and to see something happens that they would like to see happening. So that is a very interesting thread across the chapters. But some of them are more sort of, they put the emphasis on hope, others on fear. So there is a still thing that those community sort of plans and activities then sometimes get co-opted into this, if you like, the system. So it's the interplay of both, and I suppose that is the good reflection of reality, that we can see both of these. But the point is that as long as we make sure that certain things are not made invisible, then that's fine. As long as we can make the tension between vulnerability and resilience, and between the progressive and regressive visible, and be able to talk about it, then I think in a way we've done our job. Because these are going to be side by side all the time.
Simin, thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me.
With that tension between the progressive and regressive is perfect. Thank you. So, Risk Master students, in 5 minutes you'll join Johnny here.
Very nice.